Good evening. I'm Daphne Terrace. I'm the Dean of the Ted Rogers School of Management. I'm what they call the new Dean. And it's my pleasure to introduce what I hope will be an interesting speaker series. Tonight is the first in probably 3-4 a year speakers, where my goal is to bring to you speakers who will not necessarily talk about business, because at this school we hear about business all the time. So what we want to learn about is the world around us, other phenomena, what's going on in the US, what happened yesterday with the election. Before I really formally begin, I need to acknowledge the land that we're on today. Toronto is the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The topics that we'll be dealing with later on in the year are probably things like artificial intelligence and how it affects the counseling industry. Maybe I can get the people that invented Elsie, the avatar therapist, to come. I have a friend who's the world's authority on procrastination, but I can't pin him down to a date. But that was like ducks in a barrel, come on. Today's event is a collaboration with our colleagues in the Faculty of Communication and Design, and I have special thanks and acknowledgement to Dean Charles Falzone, who unfortunately got sick this afternoon. I saw him a few hours ago and he had little pinpricks of red stuff, and I hope that I'm not getting it, and the whole meeting that he was in, we're not getting it. But Charles Falzone had a distinguished career in the entertainment industry before joining academia. His specialty is media marketing. He has a strong interest in media ethics. I wish he was here to receive our acknowledgement. I also want to thank our sponsor, Hogg, Shane, and Sheck, who also have generously donated to me this stress ball that I am now squeezing. So thank you so much. Ed Sheck is our Alumni Award recipient from last year. It's really nice to have you here as an Alumni Award recipient. And Hogg, Shane, and Sheck specializes in tax, audit, and advisory. Several members of the firm are with us tonight. And I thank them for being so excited about David Shribman coming that they basically stepped up and said, yeah, speaker series, we want to sponsor it. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you David Shribman, who is the executive editor and vice president of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. There is a very lengthy bio of him in your program, so I'm just going to summarize it by saying that David is a specialist in presidents. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of American presidents and how they are impacted by their sentiments on religion, which I read. And he served as a political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He covered national politics for the New York Times. He's a member of the national staff of the Washington Star. You know, it goes on and on and on. This is a man who's had an incredibly distinguished career in the media and now is the senior editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. The reason that I'm saying the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is that in addition to discussing on the day after the US midterm election, the results, we're so happy that he flew up from Pittsburgh to be with us. Also, he's the editor who last week had to cover the massacre in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and probably is the first newspaperman in US history who had a headline written in Hebrew in an American paper using an Aramaic prayer of the Jewish mourners' prayer. And so he's had a miserable week, and we can ask him for his insights about both the American election and crisis coverage at a time of terrible sorrow. On behalf of Ryerson, I want to thank you for coming and for you to know that Ryerson University had a memorial ceremony just last week, and our hearts really go out to the suffering that you had last week. So it's my pleasure to bring you up to the stage.
Okay. Thank you, Dean Terrace. I was intrigued by what Dean Terrace said about this series, about having speakers who aren't going to talk about business. When I went to the Wall Street Journal, was contemplating going to the Wall Street Journal, I was a little scared about that, because though I have a wife who was a business writer and a daughter who has an MBA from Stanford, I know nothing about business and don't really care a whole lot about it. And that's evident because we're losing $20 million a year at my newspaper, so I wouldn't use us as a case study around here. It's not the best business model in town. In any case, I said to the editor of the Wall Street Journal, who was talking to me about coming there, Norman Polstein, who's now the editor of the Los Angeles Times. So I said, I don't even know. I never read the Journal. If you had nude weather girls on page 2, I wouldn't know. And he assured me that he didn't. And that I should not worry about what else was in the paper. I should worry about what I was writing. And in fact, the goal of the Wall Street Journal, as I suspect the goal of this series, Dean Terrace, is to enhance the understanding of people in business about the world around them. So I salute Ryerson for this initiative. I thank my friends at the firm here for sponsoring it, and I thank all of you for coming out. Apparently the Maple Leafs aren't playing tonight. In any case, I wanted to talk a few minutes about what happened 3 blocks from my house. I was at the gym, wasting time, when I got a call from another one of my workout friends saying he had just driven by the Tree of Life Synagogue, which is at the corner of Shady Avenue and Wilkins, and that he saw a bunch of police officers leaving the synagogue and shooting into the synagogue, and that doesn't happen all that often in our neighborhood. So I, without regard for hygiene, I got out of the gym and drove home. Before I realized, of course, that my work was at downtown and not there. But I was confronted with all of these remarkable armada of police officers and ambulances. For some reason, I had left the house and put the laundry in. And some impulse prompted me, I wrote about this in the New York Times, some impulse prompted me to return to the house in the middle of this shooting episode and to put the wet laundry in the dryer. Because there was something in me that needed to have something clean. I went back to the office, and of course that began 7 days of searing coverage of this horrific episode, the worst day in the history of Pittsburgh, the worst anti-Semitic attack in North American history, an absolutely horrific event that occurred basically around the corner from my house. I'll tell you that our staff, I know there's some journalism students here, didn't have to be called into the office. They streamed into the office. We don't often have many people around on Saturdays. And they streamed into the office, and we worked darn hard and put out a great newspaper that day. And it occurred to us in the course of all of this that our job in this community's suffering was to provide a service, and that service was, number 1, to speak to Pittsburgh, and number 2, to speak of Pittsburgh and to speak for Pittsburgh. I thought a lot about a historical story that I remembered for some reason from graduate school. It involved the days after the Nazi mobilization into Belgium on the way to France. And across the channel were all of these British parliamentarians who had hoped against hope that Hitler didn't really mean it and that appeasement might work. And of course, Chamberlain was the British Prime Minister at the time. And there was a debate as the German soldiers were moving through Belgium and heading to France about what England should do. And Chamberlain dithered, as he was wont to do, and he hesitated. And one of the labor ministers stood up and said, "Speak for England." And I came to think that our job was to speak for Pittsburgh. So for the next 7 or 8 days, we tried to speak for Pittsburgh in this remarkable moment of searing sadness. What I learned about my own community, and what I think the world learned about Squirrel Hill, which is our little enclave, where there are 11 synagogues within a mile of my home, several churches, a mosque, et cetera, was that we lived in a pretty remarkable place, not only because of the Steelers and the Penguins, which repeatedly do better than your Maple Leafs, though not this week, but because in many communities, after horrific events like this, there begins to be an outreach from different faiths to each other, from different interest groups to each other, and we didn't have to do that because those bridges had been constructed well in advance, that synagogues and mosques work together. I'm Jewish, my wife is Catholic. We're kind of a personification of Pittsburgh and Squirrel Hill. Of course, with a Jewish father and a Catholic wife, it's totally understandable that our daughter is about to become a rabbi. I told that story actually to Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut once, and I said, you know, my wife had 16 years of Catholic education and was a trustee of a Jesuit college, and our daughter's going to be a rabbi, and his answer was, the Jesuits, they always win in the end. Anyhow, those bridges had been built, and so they were remarkable moments of outreach, but they weren't, in a way, remarkable at all, because we had been doing this all along. And so I'm proud to say that I'm a dual citizen of the United States and Canada. So I know your country, or our country, I should say, and my country, my native country, quite well, and I think it was a remarkable moment in the history of Pittsburgh and of the United States. I'm so sad. One of my reporters came in to say that his mother had lunch with 2 of the victims every day for the last 2 years. Another one was so distraught that he could barely work. We have sent some of our reporters to the Jewish newspaper to help them out in their moment of distress, and having sent meals to newspapers after the catastrophes in Florida and in Annapolis, Maryland, we were the recipients of meals from newspaper reporters all over the country. Tonight, our reporters are having sandwiches courtesy of the Tampa Bay Tribune. So we're very grateful to all of them, and we're very grateful to you at Ryerson. I know you had a memorial service here, and there were such memorial services all over the world, and we're very, very grateful. The healing will begin, but it won't be a full healing. I don't know how we're going to drive by that corner ever again. We drove by it every day for 16 years. Let me also talk about the real topic here, which is the election. Ordinarily, when you give a lecture at a distinguished university like this one, you have a prepared text and you give an enormous amount of thought to it. But as Dean Taras said, this is not a conventional lecture series, and I haven't given a lot of thought to this, in part because I'm so exhausted, and in part because you can't prepare 3 or 4 weeks in advance for something that happened only several hours ago. But I'm glad to have a chance to talk about this. I've written about it also already in the Globe and Mail and in my own paper. I have a column in the Globe and Mail about once a week. And to say that this was an important moment in American history. Midterm congressional elections are one of the features of our democracy. They occur in what we call off years. These are even-numbered years, not divisible by 4. So you have them in 1966, you have them in 1970, 1974, et cetera. You have business students, you can do the rest of the math. And so in these, ordinarily, the party out of power, which is to say the party that doesn't occupy the White House, tends to make some gains, sometimes fairly substantial. I'm going to chart here if I can find it. Obama lost 66 seats in 2010, I think. President Johnson, both President Johnsons, Andrew Johnson in the 19th century and President Lyndon Johnson in the 20th century, lost seats in congressional races. We have heard repeatedly that this is the most significant midterm election in American history. And like most comments like that, it's beguiling and irresistible and wrong. I would say the most significant midterm elections are 3 or 4 of them. 1862 in the middle of the Civil War, where Lincoln lost a lot of seats. 1866, when President Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after his assassination, was roundly repudiated. I'd say the most important one was in 1918, 6 days before the end of World War I, when Woodrow Wilson, who had grand ideas about the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, an episode that was chronicled by a historian down the street at the University of Toronto in a most distinguished way. He was repudiated. He lost 6 seats in the Senate, and as a result, the Senate never voted to agree to the Treaty of Versailles in the United States. Despite the growth of Nazism in Germany, despite the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, despite the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which became Manchukuo, the United States retreated behind its own shores and never joined the League of Nations. That was a far more significant event than yesterday, which is not to say that yesterday's events were insignificant. As the chart behind me shows, and it's a little washed out, so you should probably look at your programs here. You can see that the Democrats lost some support in the Senate. That's not insignificant. The margins, as you will probably remember from those Kavanaugh hearings, was very, very close, and we were looking at 2 people defecting from the Republican caucus to vote against Kavanaugh, if indeed that's was going to happen. Now the margin that the Republicans have is much greater, and future Supreme Court nominations won't be as close as this last one. As many of you know who've been looking at your Twitter feed or sneaking looks during our talk at your phone, I don't discourage that, know that the Attorney General of the United States was fired earlier today. There will be a confirmation hearing for his successor that will have a Senate vote. The Senate votes to ratify treaties and to confirm presidential appointments. And so the successor to Jeff Sessions will have to go before the confirmation hearings in the Senate, led by Republicans, and he'll have an easier time than he might have had 3 or 4 days ago. Then if you look at the second chart about the House, you'll see a couple of remarkable things. First of all, the heart of America, and I say that literally, though not as metaphorically, is Republican. With the exception of the coast, and you can see very dramatically the entire West Coast, with a little exception at Washington State there, and all of the Northeast, with a little exception of New Jersey there, is blue, the Democratic blue. And the rest of the country is red. And the rest of the country, is where the election in 2020 will be fought and won or lost. I was in Iowa just 2 days ago. You see that Iowa is half red and half blue, or in our parlance, purple. Iowa is an important state because it has the first caucuses of the 2020 election. I have to warn you, it's only 2 years away. We'll be starting doing that next week. So, with the exception of Iowa, which, as you see, is divided, Iowa is the one, it's the one that's divided. The prairies are red, Republican. And that is despite the president's trade policies that disadvantage the export of corn, soybeans, and wheat, but nonetheless responds to the Republican and now the Trump, though they are not the same, we'll get to that in a moment, to the Republican ethos and to the notion of folks being left behind by the elitists on the coast. The coast, as I said, are blue. California is a good example. The eastern part of California, which is the Central Valley, is all red. That's where the farmers are. That's industrial. The western part, where the elitists live, including, I must say, my daughter, elitist daughter, is all blue. So what we have here is not so much a situation where neighbors are living beside neighbors with whom they disagree politically, but we have a whole country in which people live with people they agree with, generally speaking, and it's cost us a lot. I'll talk in a few minutes, I suppose maybe I'll do it now, about the most important change, I think, in my lifetime in American politics, and it's reflected in these two maps. When I began to have interest in American politics, I wasn't a precocious child, but I did have interest even as a child in politics. There was a Republican Party that had liberals and conservatives. The conservatives, you can understand, they're the kind of conservatives we have now. They were basically believed in what I call root canal economics. I knew I'd get an economics phrase in there. They were against deficits. They wanted balanced budgets. They didn't want to spend any money. They were skeptical of overseas entanglements. But generally speaking, and they went to church a lot, and they didn't agree with anything newfangled whatsoever. They were the kind of conservatives that you don't see very much anymore, but the Republican Party had those kind of conservatives. And then it had liberals. Some of them were in the Midwest, and some were in the East Coast. But the point was there were liberals and conservatives in the Republican Party. Then let's take the Democratic Party. There were liberals in the Democratic Party. You know their names: McGovern, Muskie, McCarthy. True liberals in the Democratic Party, and then conservatives. You may not know their names, but they were the old bulls, mostly segregationists, many of them deep racists, who were in the South. They controlled much of the Democratic Party machinery, and so that as a result, the Democrats had a conservative and Republican, conservative and liberal wing. And those two parties, if they were a Venn diagram, would have a huge intersection in which the liberals from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party could work together, and so could the conservatives. It will surprise you, and it astonishes young people to know that more Republicans voted to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and 1965 Voting Rights Act than did Democrats. We think of that as a big Democratic achievement. It was done by President Johnson in the wake of the assassination of President Kennedy, but mostly it was Republicans. And when after the death of President Kennedy, his widow thanked the Republican ranking minority member of the Judiciary Committee of Ohio for having given the moral boost to that legislation. Well, today, we have a situation that political scientists have wanted in America for many, many years, which is why you should never listen to political scientists. Beginning as early as 1956, there were a series of arguments in political science journals ridiculing the American party system, that it is a fraud, it makes no sense, it has no ideological integrity, there's no discipline in those parties. There's liberals and conservatives mushed together, and these parties mean nothing. What we need is ideological parties. Well, now we have them, and it's not so great. We have a conservative party that's called the Republicans, and we have a liberal party that's called the Democrats, and ne'er the twain shall meet. In fact, for the first time in our history, the most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. It's a situation that causes us to have no conversations across the aisle in our politics. Our politics, as you know, is structured differently from yours. The result is that for the first time in American history, or in modern American history, we cannot really have any bipartisan legislation at all. Now, I know that's a foreign concept here, but it's one that's dear to us. The major social pieces of legislation in our history, modern history, involved Republicans and Democrats voting together. 1935, the Social Security Act. 1965, the Medicare Act. Of course, I just mentioned 64 and 65, the Voting Rights Act, and before that, the Civil Rights Act. The Obamacare, which produced a health system that you would find not particularly remarkable and not particularly visionary, had no Republican votes, not one. The Trump tax bill had no Democratic votes, not one. As recently as 1986, Republicans and Democrats worked together on a major tax bill, the most important tax bill of our generation. And it was a Reagan and Rostenkowski and Speaker O'Neill combo deal. That's inconceivable today. And so you can see that in these maps, and certainly the House map. I'll give you a quick tour de horizon of the election. And then I'd really rather have a conversation amongst us with the questions you want to ask, but let me just say briefly some of the highlights. Women. Women won a lot of Democratic seats and some Republicans. A Republican woman was elected, first woman elected governor of Iowa, also in Kansas. The first two Native American women, what you would call equivalent of first Canadians, were elected in the Democratic Party yesterday. The first two Islamic women were elected to Congress. That's a remarkable moment for the United States. Many of the Democrats who were elected are to the left of the rest of the Democratic caucus, and some of them are right dead in the center. In both in New York and Massachusetts, young women under 30 were, both women of color, were elected to the House, having defeated major figures in the Democratic Party in primaries. They both are affiliated with or congenial to small s socialism, which is unusual in our politics. We also had the repudiation of some Democratic members of the Senate. Particularly, the best examples are in North Dakota and Indiana. You can see that on your map. Important elements as we look to the 2020 election, presidential election, the role of women, of course, suburban women in particular, who revile Trump. They came out in record numbers to defeat anybody with an R beside their names. More generally, women were an important factor. Many, of course, were elected. I kind of think of 1992, the election there, as the year of the woman. You hear that phrase a lot because a number of women were elected to the Senate and House that year. This, I think, is a little different. This is a year of the woman voter because women voters were such an important part of this. Male voters with blue-collar backgrounds and without a college education were present and heavily influential in the red areas, rural areas. They voted for Trump in astonishing numbers. Many of them had been Democrats. Their parents had been Democrats. They, too, voted their hearts and voted Republican. Although the Democrats are crowing about their great victory, they should be careful because pretty much everywhere that Trump campaigned, his candidate won. That allowed the president to say, make one of his more remarkable comments of the week, and that he was the big winner of the week. He may be the only person in Christendom who believes that, but nonetheless, his record was pretty darn good. A lot of people are talking about, several people here asked me about that Senate race in Texas with this fellow named Beto, who didn't win, but who did seem to alight people's passions. He ran a good race and didn't win. I'll remind you, I'm looking out here, many of you may have remembered the 1858 Senate race in Illinois. I covered that, was one of my early ones. That was between Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, known as the Little Giant, and a one-term congressman, ne'er-do-well, named Abraham Lincoln. And they went around the country, went around Illinois, and they had 7 remarkable debates, the most remarkable debates in American history, more remarkable even than the Kennedy-Nixon ones of 1960. And Stephen Douglas won that Senate race. 2 years later, the loser of the Senate race was elected president. So I wouldn't dismiss the notion that Beto O'Rourke you might hear from again. A couple other comments. The president wasn't humbled so much that he didn't fire his attorney general today. We'll have to see how he reacts and what he does in the next couple of days. He never fails to astonish. He's a jobs program for reporters, though he likes to describe us as the enemies of the people, a sinister phrase that dates to Stalin and to Lenin. We are in fact the oxygen he breathes, and for somebody who hates us so much, he loves us desperately. He is a remarkable character, the first president we've ever had who lacked political or military service. Never was elected to office, never served in the military. Every one of our other presidents had done one or the other, and many of them have done both. We do have a tradition, you know, of electing generals. 6 Civil War generals became president of the United States. General Eisenhower, in our own time, or in many of your time and mine, was a 2-term president. And every other president, with the exception of Trump, had that kind of experience. So I think what I'd like to do now, we have a whole lot of time left, and I can sense that there are a lot of questions. I'd like to open it up to talk about what you want to talk about. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. If they're really tough, I'll probably evade them. My goal here is to answer your questions in a way that amuses and pleases you, but also mystifies you, and for you to leave not having the slightest idea what I actually think.
I can't understand how a Republican woman could vote for Trump after what he's put them through. I just can't understand it. Could you help us?
The goal of Paradise Lost was to explain God's ways to man. I can't explain everything on earth, and that's a hard one. But a lot of women in rural areas in particular feel, as their male counterpoints do that their interests have been ignored by the Democrats. Many of them were Democrats or grew up in Democratic households. They feel sneered upon by Democrats, particularly Hillary Rodham Clinton. They found Hillary repellent and repugnant. And they voted their sentiments. A lot of people find other people's political views inscrutable. I repeatedly tell people who live in Pittsburgh and who work with me and who can't understand why anybody voted for Trump, because we live in an area where Trump was soundly defeated, that if you drove 10 miles from the office, you would find people who would find it astonishing that anybody could vote against Trump. I think a lot of people on the coast, and I would say in the metropolitan areas of Canada, find Trump repellent and inscrutable. But I have to remind my colleagues, and maybe you as well, that a lot of people felt that way about Obama. Not because he was black, but perhaps maybe, but because his views were so out of sync with theirs. And so the divide in America is so strong right now that these two sides don't understand each other, in part because they don't ever encounter each other. My rabbinical school daughter called me up the night before the election, 2016, said, "I don't know anybody who supports Trump." And I said, "Of course you don't. But some of the people who support Trump don't know anybody who supported Hillary." So it's a very dangerous situation. It's a very dangerous way for civilization to live. Great Britain doesn't live this way. You don't live this way. And it's very, very dangerous.
What role do you think that racism is playing in American politics? Because I notice on the map, even in the red areas, in all of the municipal areas, all of the urban areas tend to look blue, even in a very red state, and then the rural are all red. Urban areas, I think, in the United States have more people of color as we do here. Is that not the case? So what role do you think race might have in this?
Well, I think it's unavoidable that race has something to do with everything in the United States. Race determined how the Constitution was written, ascribing only 3/5 of humanity of a vote, and they didn't even have the vote, to African Americans in the apportionment scheme. Race dominated American politics from, I'd say, 1813 through yesterday. The Civil War, you can't understand American history in what was known as the era of good feeling, and then the Jacksonian period through Lincoln, without understanding that that all of American politics in that period was about race. The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, some of these things that you may have encountered in a cursory way in your reading. All of American politics, in some ways, is about race, and it always has been. It's impossible to think of the politics of the 60s without thinking about race. When President Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, let me give you a sense of what politics in America was like then. All of the South was Democratic. I believe 21 of the 22 senators in 1964 from the old Confederacy, the 11 states that had withdrawn from the Union in 1861 and 62, every one of those lawmakers was a Democrat. It was inconceivable to find a Republican in the South. When George H.W. Bush in 1964 ran for the U.S. House, he ran as a Republican, and people thought he was crazy, that it was a suicide mission. He had been Harris County, which is to say Houston, Harris County chairman of the Republican Party, and basically they could have held their meetings in a phone booth. I'll remind the students a little bit later what a phone booth was. So he signed this bill, and as he signed this bill, he said in an aside, "I have just signed away the Democratic Party for the next generation," because all of those Democrats became Republicans in reaction, because of race, generally speaking, in reaction to the president's signing of that bill. Now, let's think for a second who those Democrats were. The Democrats were, from 1866 on, the people who had supported slavery, who fought to overturn Reconstruction, who tried to re-enslave the freed slaves, if not in legal ways, but in de facto slavery, and who created this notion of the lost cause of Confederacy, which elevated the Confederacy into some kind of near nirvana in the minds of Southerners, and that was what American politics was all about. From 1964 on, the Republicans began to take over, or began to move into the South, or the South turned a little bit red. You remember in 1968, President Nixon was elected on what was called the Southern Strategy. He talked a lot about law and order. Well, you know what that meant. That meant all those blacks who were rioting in Cleveland and Detroit. He talked in not so subtle ways about domestic issues in a way that began to appeal to to the South. By 1972, Nixon won every one of the southern states. The Democrats only clawed back a little bit in '76 because they nominated a governor from Georgia, whom nobody in this room will remember. And then by 1980, when Reagan ran, and he began his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was where the 4 civil rights activists had been slain in the early '60s. The Republican Party basically was a Southern party, which it is today. So what role did race play in this election? The same thing it's played in 1964 on. It's the dominant theme in American history, and I think more and more historians and political commentators are coming to believe that.
What message do you think Democrats are going to have to unite behind in order to defeat Trump in 2020?
So the question is, what message the Democrats going to have 2 years from now in the presidential election? And they're debating that now. There's one strain of the Democratic Party that says, don't be like Hillary, be like Bill. Okay? They're not saying that, but Bill Clinton ran from the center. He was from a southern state, Arkansas. By the way, Arkansas is totally red right now. You can take a look there. If you can, the 11 among you who know where Arkansas is, it's totally red. So Bill Clinton ran from the center, congenial to business. He went out of his way to make sure he presided over the execution of a mentally unfit person for murder, not the kind of thing Democrats do, cynical but effective for the governor of Arkansas running. Don't forget, he ran a 3-way race. And he ran from the center. Obama ran pretty much from the center. Now, there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who believe the center is not where they should be right now, that they so loathe Trump, so revile him, find him so repellent that they want to run from the left. There's a huge debate going on in the Democratic Party right now. They'll have this debate for the next 2 years. There will be probably another 20 people running for president in 2020. Some of them will be so obscure they couldn't be recognized by their own mother. And that won't be good for the Democrats. That produced Trump, by the way, 17 people in the race. But they can't decide whether to run from the center or from the left. And the younger voters who came out in record numbers, though not big enough to exceed older voters, desperately want the party to run from the left. They want to emphasize issues like gay marriage, transgender rights, that kind of thing. A lot of Democrats in the center find that to be not so smart. And so there's going to be this huge debate. It's going to be a searing debate, and it's going to cause a lot of trouble in the Democratic Party. One thing I should add about the Democratic victory yesterday is that the Democrats won seats in places where they may not be able to retain them 2 years from now. So there'll be that tension as well.
You've kind of made it clear that the polarization politically in the United States has been happening for a long time, and it's not attributable to Donald Trump, although he's the latest face of it.
Right.
But one thing I would want you to comment on is what I find with Donald Trump is he's the first politician I've encountered who has a complete detachment from truth. And to what extent do you think that that's going to have a long-term impact on political discourse in the U.S. going forward?
Well, that, of course, is a preoccupation of ours in the news business, and I'm glad there's some journalism students here. You know, American politicians have told a lot of whoppers over the years. You know, President Obama said that we could all keep our doctors under Obamacare, and we can't. President Nixon Well, you could tell when the President Nixon was telling a lie, it was when his lips moved. President Johnson, in the Johnson years, my predecessors in the press invented the phrase credibility gap. I've been thinking a lot about the truth in politics. The burning of the Reichstag was blamed on communists. Probably not. The sinking of the Maine in 1898, which brought United States into the Spanish-American War, was blamed on Cubans who had nothing to do with it. They were actually Spaniards who had nothing to do with it. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1965, I think, which was the legal predicate for American involvement in Vietnam. You know, we haven't declared war since 1941. We've had all these little wars, big ones sometimes, but no declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution grew out of a episode in the Gulf of Tonkin, or Bay of Tonkin, in which we argued, or the President argued, or the administration argued that the American ships had been attacked by North Vietnamese ships, and in fact that wasn't true. My favorite example, you probably saw the movie that grew out of this, was in May 1960, a fellow named Francis Gary Powers was on a CIA reconnaissance mission in an airplane over the Soviet Union. It was shot down. I've actually spent a lot of time with that and seen these actual documents from the Eisenhower Library. And they got together and they tried to figure out a lie that the president could tell, as to protect American interests about this. So they concocted this lie that that it was a weather reconnaissance plane gone a little bit off course. Well, and they thought that this airman was dead. Inconveniently, he wasn't dead. Khrushchev and his fellow folks, presented him to the press, and it was very clear he was a CIA guy, and it was mortifying. During World War II, in April and May of 1944, the Allies produced a phony mobilization north of where the real mobilization was, trying to give Rommel and Hitler the notion that D-Day, which everybody knew was imminent, was going to be at Calais rather than at Normandy. And they had these roads they built, and they had cardboard tanks and all this phony stuff, and blow up airplanes, and Churchill said, sometimes the truth deserves an armada of lies. That's okay, but not in presidential politics. And so the president has really undermined the notion that of the truth, in a way. He says his people say that there are alternative truths. Well, my argument is, what exactly is the alternative truth to the notion that the sun is 93 million miles, or however many kilometers, from the Earth, or that 2 + 2 = 4, or that the Maple Leafs haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1967? What are exactly those alternative facts? So it's a very troubling thing for me. I will say this about my own experience. I've worked at the Buffalo Evening News, the Washington Star, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and here. Of course, you're wondering why that guy can't hold a job. And never in the 49 years that I have been associated, actually longer, since I used to be a paper boy, never once have I witnessed or been party to a paragraph, a story, a paragraph, a sentence, a word, or a syllable placed in a newspaper that was knowingly wrong. Not once. And so I would say to the president and to the others that we just don't do that. That we are the last believers. We believe in the Constitution. We believe in the First Amendment. We believe that an informed citizenry is best equipped to make good decisions about politics. And we believe that our role is central to all of that, because the American creed is that the people shall rule. And I say the codicil to that, the Shribman corollary to that, is that the people should know what the hell they're talking about. And so that is our mission, our divine, I think, or certainly divinely inspired, and noble and ennobling goal. And so I'm deeply troubled by this. As you can tell, I'm going on and on, but I think you get the sense that I don't like it.
How will these results have an influence on his policy? Because I see that the Democrats have a majority in the House. How is it going to affect his policy?
Well, for $2 tomorrow, you can read my piece in the Globe and Mail. Yeah. But I'll give you a hint. It's going to have no effect whatsoever. The Democrats are not going to be able to pass one piece of their legislation, because you know, in our system, unlike in yours, the bill doesn't go to the president until it has been passed in both houses. And if they're slightly dissimilar, they have to be reconciled in what's known as a conference committee. It's inconceivable that any Democratic piece of legislation will be approved in the Senate. Inconceivable. So the Democrats may talk about increasing the national minimum wage. Not going to happen. They may talk about other kinds of stuff. Not going to happen. The best bet for any legislation coming out of Congress and to be signed by the president, don't forget he has a veto, to be signed by the president would be a massive infrastructure initiative, several $1 trillion to repair our roads and bridges. And if you've been across the Peace Bridge lately, you'll know that that's desperately needed. You guys are willing to do this and help do this in Detroit and Buffalo, and we're not. And the other thing might be a compromise on immigration, though I doubt it. So there won't be a new tax bill. Not going to happen. Don't forget, tax bills, revenue bills, money bills in the United States Congress have to originate in the Ways and Means Committee of the United States House. And that will be controlled by Democrats. Let me say one more thing about Democratic control. Democratic control of the House means that the entire staffs of those committees are going to turn over. That the minority staffs, which by definition are smaller than the majority staffs, will become the majority staffs, and they'll hire some more people. The majority staffs will become the minority staffs, and some of those people will lose their jobs. Every single committee chairman in the House is out of work right now. Not out of work, but losing his chairmanship or his or her chairmanship. There'll be new chairs of every one of those committees. That's substantial. But the most important part of this is that the Democrats now have a forum to conduct investigations against the president, his campaign, and his administration, and those investigators will have subpoena power. So they will be able to subpoena the president's taxes, which he has not revealed. They'll be able to ask unbelievably irritating questions to the president and his administration, and they were going to drive him nuts.
You were asked questions before about what I call the uncivil war in the United States right now, which currently is just digital. And you mentioned how the polarization is so extreme. And then the question became, how could women, Republican women, vote for somebody like Trump? And there's a factor that I haven't heard so far in your analysis, which may not be apparent when you live down there, but when you live up here, there's a big difference. There are many differences, but there's a big difference on average. I'm about to commit a generalization between our two groups. Our country, for the most part, has sort of evolved beyond religion. In America, this is a meaningful component of their social, political, and economic fabric. You know, I look back at the rise of remember the oral majority, well, it was called the moral majority before it became the oral majority, but that whole phenomena, which seemed to be a direct violation of your founding principle of separation of church and state, that whole group has just hijacked it. And I mentioned it only because prior to this last election, the CBC ran a number of really good radio documentaries where they sent reporters down to, where they were embedded within different groups and camps within the United States to understand why they were going to vote the way they were. A lot of people were admitting that they wanted to vote against their parents or against their church or against, but they felt compelled by, and increasingly you kept hearing it time and time again, I don't like Trump. He's immoral. He's not Christian. But he's pro-life. And
Okay.
my pastor says, or my reverend says, and you kept thinking these people were voting because of religion. How prevalent is that? How much is that the root, that insidious notion of religion? How much is that the cause of your problems and your polarization?
Well, let me say to start that that's a better question than any answer I've given. Because America was founded, as you know, for religious freedom. Religion was a major element in all of our politics. You know, we in our business craft talk about the First Amendment, and I have to remind people sometimes that the freedom of the press is the second element of the First Amendment. The first is the freedom of religion. Religion has been an important part of much of our reform movements. You don't think maybe of temperance and prohibition as a reform movement, but it was. It was started in the churches. Desegregation and its predecessor, the abolitionism, was basically a church movement. The social gospel movement, which created so many communities and universities and colleges in the Midwest, was a religious initiative. We were marked deeply in our history by the First and Second Great Awakenings. Lincoln, who was not a religious man, his language is laced with religious themes. You can't read the first inaugural, or the second inaugural, which I consider the greatest speech in American history, without seeing religious imagery and actual quotes from the Bible in that speech. President Kennedy, when he ran for election in 1960, had to confront what was known as the Catholic factor. It's much forgotten here in our country that evangelicals were an important part of American politics in the New Deal. In 1932, evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Franklin Roosevelt. That will surprise people. He ran against a Quaker, by the way, Herbert Hoover. By the beginning of the 1970s, as you noted, evangelicals, many mainline Protestants, began to move away from the Democratic Party. They hung there a little bit for Carter because he himself, as famously was a Sunday school teacher. But by the time of the Bush-Gore race of 2000, the one that went into overtime, 36 extra days, another jobs program for reporters, by the way. By that time, it was really easy to figure out how people voted. If you went to church, you voted for the Republicans, and if you didn't go to church, you voted for the Democrats. Pure and simple. Al Gore was a regular, normal Democrat. He was the son of Al Gore Sr., one of the only two members of the of the Senate from the South who didn't sign the 1957 Southern Manifesto, which was against segregation, against integration, I mean. He was a normal, what you might call a normal Democrat. I had a talk with him once in a car in Boston, and I asked him, this was when he was running for president and trying to position himself to run against an evangelical Christian like George W. Bush, excuse me. Not an evangelical, but a born-again Christian. And I said to him, what is the purpose of your purpose in politics? And he said, it is to serve my Savior, Jesus Christ. Now, I was bowled over, because that was not the Al Gore I knew in the House, not the Al Gore I knew in the Senate or in the vice presidency, but he began to talk in that language. As Daphne said, I once wrote a long, long piece about presidents and prayer. presidents have always had some kind of a religious tint to them. Reagan never went to church, and he always talked about church-going people and God. Obama had all sorts of challenges about his own religion and whether he was a Muslim or a Christian and who his Christian pastors were. So I think you're right in saying that religion is a huge element of American politics. I still think race is more important, but why should we quibble about one or the other? They're both very, very elemental parts of our politics. Unnoticed in yesterday's results and not reflected in this chart is that the state of West Virginia passed a referendum saying that, that abortion should be illegal. Now, the national law in the United States is that abortion is legal, dating to January of 1973. But if the notion should come from the Supreme Court, as the President and many others have suggested, that the abortion should be a state issue, not a federal issue, West Virginia and about 8 or 9 other states have already said where they stand. So I think you're right. It's a great question, and he should be the next speaker.
We saw yesterday in the elections that the state of Goldwater almost went for the Democrats, may still. We've seen sort of Nevada has gone Democratic. You mentioned Beto O'Rourke was fairly close in Texas. Do you see the demographic change having an impact in future elections in the direction of the Republican Party? Can they still be a white Southern party forever?
Well, you know, that's another excellent question, and it also reflects something else: the constant changing character of certain states. In, I think probably 1924, 1926, a president of Grinnell College, which is now a very liberal college in the center of Iowa, said that Iowa would go Democratic when hell went, no, Iowa would go Democratic when hell went Methodist. Well, you know, Iowa is one of the only 10 states that voted for Michael Dukakis. Demographics are changing the nature of our politics. The Democrats are constantly saying we're going to eventually prevail because Hispanics and blacks are going, them together, are going to outnumber whites, and that we'll be fine. Well, I don't know when that's going to happen, and I think the date now is something like 2036 or something of that nature. It's too bad this is being recorded because I didn't make up that number, but I don't know for sure what it is. And so demographics are affecting the politics of Arizona. It's changing the politics of New Mexico. It's been a huge issue in California and also in Florida. Now, all Hispanics aren't alike. That's a tautology, obviously, but some Hispanics with roots in Latin America feel very differently, and Central and Latin America feel very differently from Hispanics from Cuba, for example, which is why you see Cuban American voters voting differently from Nicaraguan American voters. So it is true, but it's more complicated than Hispanics are going to be Democrats. It's much more complicated than that because many Hispanics in Florida are Republicans, mostly because they hate and hated Castro, and they feel that the Republicans are better servants of their vigilance against communism from Cuba.
Where do you see legislation going on trade now, with the bloc really being between the House and the Senate?
I think that's an issue that is less an issue of party than an issue of region. And so, you know, if you go from Maine to Vermont to New York to, then you've got to skip Ohio, I guess, and go over to Michigan and Wisconsin. I don't want to show off by naming them all, but you get the general sense. All those guys are going to be for, they're all going to be for good trade relations with Canada. The funny, interesting conundrum is what labor leaders do about trade and about Trump. They don't like Trump. They like a lot of his protectionist legislation. I think a lot about my friend, I have to say my friend Leo Gerard, my friend Sam Marinucci has met at a hockey game in Pittsburgh. He is from a mining town in Ontario, here in Ontario. He is the international president of the United Steelworkers. So United States, Canada. Now, he's no friend of Trump, but he's really interested in protection for steel. So a lot of people are in very difficult positions. But I would say, generally speaking, geography is Canada's friend. It always has been. I think it will be even more so in the next couple of years. Sometimes it's useful to see where products are made, and that will tell you how they feel. For example, a lot of, I was in Iowa this week, but a lot of lawmakers, Republican lawmakers from Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, people forget that, well, you won't hear because you know that Manitoba and Saskatchewan are wheat producers, but North Dakota and Eastern Washington, people who represent they want easy trade in agricultural products. So I think it goes to geography and to the industrial base or the agricultural base or whatever state you're talking about. I do a fair amount of speaking in the United States and Canada, and it's unusual to get questions of this quality. As I say, the question from the gentleman over there was better than any answer I gave, and I think maybe you might be a surrogate for me next time. And I just want to thank all of you. You know, we have an expression in the United States, maybe you have it in Canada, that people vote with their feet. You voted with your feet and contributed an hour and 15 minutes of your time to this. I'm very, very grateful. I feel very strongly about ties between the United States and Canada. I'm a product of a Montreal mother and a Massachusetts father. I am quite literally the product of a United States-Canada relationship. So I want to thank you very much, and I hope I'll see you again.